Good evening, and I hand over to Dr. Usha Singh, who is the convener. A hearty welcome to everyone for the symposium.
Everyone,
Good evening, everyone.
good
I
evening.
welcome all to this National Symposium on Oculoplastics. The most wanted topics of oculoplastics will be delivered and discussed by the most experienced and eminent of oculoplastic surgeons. And chairman for this session is no other than Dr. Abjeet Kaur, and co-chairman is Dr. Mukesh Sharma, and my co-convener is Dr. Ravindra Mohan. The moderator is Dr. Feroz. I request all to take the chair, please. Uh, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Abjeet,
It's
a
7
few words
o'clock.
before we hand over the moderator, hand over the session to the moderator.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, although virtually, but it's good to see your faces once again. This session has some very, very important topics, including the most recent one, which is Mucor. And our panel is actually a scintillating panel of performers. So without much ado, I hand over for the further proceedings.
Let's go on to the first speaker of the day, Dr. Santosh G. Hunavar, who's going to talk on mucormycosis. And we all know this is the need of the hour at this point of time. Over to you, sir. Thank you. Please share your screen.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, absolutely. And you're audible.
All right. So I'll be talking about stage-based management approach and some real-world data on mucormycosis. This we published in February this year. This was a collection of just 6 cases from Hyderabad and Mumbai. We thought that was a bit too many at that time, but we never thought that we would see 12,000 cases from March 2021. That is the entire Indian data. Looking at what is published, some of the meta-analysis, we find these are the risk factors associated with mucor and COVID. Diabetes, use of corticosteroids, use of tocilizumab, elderly individuals who had severe COVID infection, mechanical ventilation, and prolonged supplemental oxygen. Of course, India is the diabetes capital of the world, and mucormycosis is 80 times higher in India, even in the pre-COVID-19 era. But what makes COVID special is that there is loss of mucosal immunity in the point of entry and point of proliferation. And it is the same route that mucor also follows. And this mucosal immunity remains impaired for a very prolonged period of time. Mucor is everywhere. As we breathe, as we speak, we are inhaling mucor. That is an exogenous source. But apart from that, mucor also happens to be a commensal in the nasopharynx and PNS. So in a predisposed individual with loss of mucosal immunity, these commensals can take over and grow. Recently, we completed the analysis of 2,826 cases from 108 centers in India. And we found that we had a slight higher predisposition for younger individuals. In fact, the peak was slightly towards the, I would say, left, because younger individuals were found to have higher incidence here with a mean age of 53 years, whereas pre-COVID era, this was much higher. And also we found that the peak of onset of first symptom was on the 14th day, which means, and many of these were hospitalized patients, majority of them, which means that knowing the incubation period of mucormycosis, this was acquired while the patient was admitted in the hospital. And of course, there was prolonged onset as well, more than 3 weeks in 16% of patients, more than 2 weeks in 44% of patients. So the peak onset of symptom of mucormycosis was in the middle of their COVID disease. Surprisingly, 23% were non-diabetics and 21% had received no corticosteroids. Only 2% had received tocilizumab. And we found that about 20% of patients were non-hospitalized and they did not receive steroids as well. So there were a bunch of patients who were young, who were home cared with minimal or no steroids. And these were the symptoms and signs. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, orbital and facial pain, orbital and facial edema predominated. And you can see most of these symptoms are ophthalmic, ptosis, loss of vision, and even in other symptoms, proptosis, diplopia, orbital and facial discoloration. All these are related to ophthalmology. And the signs mirror the symptoms. So why do we have to stage the disease? Because we know that the disease starts initially in the nose, paranasal sinuses, and then gets into the orbit and finally into the brain. That is a sequence of events. And some of these, of course, bypass the regular channels and can be non-contiguous and can be through vascular channels as well. But the classic way of transmission of the disease and progression of the disease is what we have taken into consideration to stage it. Now, stage 1 is predominantly in the nasal mucosa, where the first part to get affected is supposed to be the middle turbinate, which manifests as the first MRI sign as black turbinate or non-contrast enhancing turbinate. If you do MRI at that stage, you might find less enhancement or relatively less enhancement of the nasal mucosa as compared to the other side. And blackening of the nasal mucosa and the turbinate can be a little later sign. The patient at this point in time will have nasal stuffiness, blockage, and a blackish or a blood-thin discharge. In stage 2, there is involvement of the paranasal sinuses, where if only ethmoid sinus or one sinus is involved, that is stage 2A. If there are two sinuses involved, like here, you have ethmoid and as well as maxillary sinus. And you also see that this is the infraorbital nerve. Around that, there is a lesion that gives one of the early symptoms of hyperesthesia of the cheek area. Patients can complain of that, and that is one of the currently considered as one of the early signs. And you can see black turbinate here as well. And if the disease progresses to involve the palate, etc., then that is stage 2C. And if bilateral paranasal sinus involvement, that we consider 2D. In the orbit, if it goes through the nasolacrimal duct to the medial orbit where the vision is unaffected, that is 3A. The first radiological MRI sign in the orbit is supposed to be a thickening of the medial rectus muscle or a haziness around the medial rectus muscle, because if the lesion goes through the nasolacrimal duct into inframedial orbit, that can very quickly reach the medial orbit, or if it goes trans-ethmoidally through the lamina baptizer of ethmoid, again it goes to the medial orbit. So inflammation around the medial rectus is supposed to be one of the early signs. Restricted motility can also result because of infiltration around the muscle, and sometimes the lesion can be grossly mechanically restrict the ocular motility. When multiple sinuses are involved, more than one, and also if there is an area of the orbit that is involved beyond one quadrant, then that is 3B. 3C is when there is ophthalmoplegia because of superior orbital fissure involvement or orbital apex involvement. Some of these patients have direct fungal invasion of the orbital apex and superior orbital fissure through the sphenoid, and also they may not have much of fungal bulk in the orbit. It may be direct involvement of the superior orbital fissure that results in a white eye with ophthalmoplegia. This patient has minimal proptosis, but she has complete ophthalmoplegia because of involvement of the orbital apex. CRAO is also one of the early symptoms, signs. And in stage 3C, we also have diffuse orbital involvement, as we see here. And stage 3D is bilateral. In stage 4, there is CNS involvement, either partly or completely involvement of the cavernous sinus, and sometimes it passes through the foramen rotundum, pterygopalatine fossa, foramen rotundum, and directly gets into the midbrain. Then patients present with bilateral third nerve palsy. This is one such example. This is brain infarction 4C, and this is diffuse CNS. This is 4D. In our study, we found that majority of patients presented at stage 3, which is the orbital involvement. So in diagnosis, microbiopsy of the nasal mucosa appears to have the best diagnostic yield, which means that in the clinic, you take a bit of the affected nasal mucosa under visualization. Endoscopy guided nasal mucosal swab also has equally good diagnostic accuracy. And for a quick diagnosis, you can rely on rapid histopathology such as splash and imprint cytology and frozen section, which can give you diagnosis in 15 minutes. Of course, we have microbiology, calcium white, and KOH mount as one of the standard ways of diagnosing. And in scanning, imaging is extremely important. CT scan lags behind. So what is important is to do a good MRI, and MRI signs have already been described. In the management, the first thing that we do is an RT-PCR. If the patient is positive, then you admit with all COVID precautions. If the patient is RT-PCR negative, then you admit in a critical care unit, but obviously without COVID precautions. Then if the patient has possible mucormycosis, where the patient has typical symptoms and signs in the clinical setting, that is less than 6 weeks after having been treated with COVID-19, with diabetes mellitus, immunosuppression, etc., then if the patient does not have any MRI or CT sign and nasal endoscopy shows normal mucosa, in that case, you still keep the patient under suspicion and observe every 24 hours for progression. If the patient responds to symptomatic treatment, then obviously mucormycosis is unlikely, but you continue to observe them for a prolonged period of time, that is 3 weeks. If a patient during observation develops any of the radiological or clinical signs, he goes into the category of probable mucormycosis. At the point of presentation itself, if the patient has symptoms as well as signs, which is radiological and clinical, then the patient is categorized as probable mucormycosis. Proven is when you have evidence by microbiology as well as or histopathology, then that is considered proven mucormycosis. In either of this, probable or proven, you're bound to start them on amphotericin B, preferably liposomal in full dose, which is 5 milligram per kg body weight. In the absence of liposomal amphotericin B, you can start them on deoxycholate or lipid complex, but we should realize that these are more nephrotoxic. If the patient has a compromised renal function, then you can consider posaconazole or isavuconazole as one of the options. After having started these patients on antifungals, which is the first step that you would take, you would prepare them for surgery. If a patient has predominantly sinus or sinonasal manifestation, then you do an early aggressive debridement of the paranasal sinuses by appropriate surgical approach. And for the minimal orbital component, you can give intraorbital amphotericin B, which is 3.5 milligram per ml of deoxycholate, and observe the patient very carefully. During observation, if the patient progresses to involve the orbit diffusely, or if there is worsening of the orbital component within 72 hours after having done debridement and started the patient on amphotericin B, then you may consider orbital exentration. If the disease is still limited at that stage, you may consider intraorbital amphotericin B. If a patient at the point of diagnosis itself has extensive orbital involvement, has PL negative eye with limited or no CNS disease, then you combine orbital exentration along with paranasal sinus debridement. If a patient has extensive CNS involvement, then our study has shown that despite having extensive CNS involvement, if you were to do orbital exentration, then the chance of survival is higher. So you may still want to do orbital exentration even in a patient who has extensive CNS involvement, provided the patient is fit for surgery. Then once you have given amphotericin and the patient has radiologically and clinically stabilized, then you consider step-down therapy with oral posaconazole or isavuconazole. This is just an example of orbital exentration. And this is a patient who did not need orbital exentration, was controlled just with paranasal sinus debridement and intraorbital amphotericin B. In our series, we found that these 41% of patients were definitely regressed and alive. 14% were obviously definitely dead. But in the middle, some of who were stable clinically with some residual disease and some are progressing, obviously they can shift to either of this. So we have...
Very sorry to interrupt, sir.
Okay, fine. I'm done with it. All right. So the conclusion is that we should moderate steroid use, control diabetes mellitus, and be aware of the red flag symptoms and signs. Barrier and hygiene are important. Appropriate ophthalmic and ENT consult if the patient has any of the red flag signs, and a high index of suspicions and combined efforts by a multidisciplinary team are important in ensuring survival. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Santosh. We will go to the next talk on thyroid eye disease, new paradigm by Dr. Ashok Grover. Dr. Ashok Grover, please.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Usha and Fairuz and Santosh. After that amazing talk by Santosh, a landmark work, which we all will look forward to for a long, long time, I go on to the subject of thyroid eye disease. Thyroid eye disease, as we know, is an autoimmune inflammatory disorder affecting the orbital tissues with characteristic signs that involve the eye and orbital tissues. We know that the most affected age groups are from 30 to 50 years of age, and females are more likely to develop thyroid-associated orbitopathy. This figure may not be as high in Indian subcontinent as it is in the US or in Caucasians, but still the females are the predominantly affected people. The thyroid status most often is hyperthyroidism, although euthyroid Hashimoto's thyroiditis may also be associated. For the pathogenesis, we know that the TSH receptors and the insulin growth factor receptors, IGF-1R receptors of the orbital fibroblasts are the target of the autoantibodies, which result in various changes, including the enlargement of the extraocular muscles, infiltration by the inflammatory cells, and proliferation of orbital fat, connective tissue, and lacrimal gland tissue, and fibrosis in all these structures. The clinical course is an active inflammatory phase which may last anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, followed by a decreasing activity and an inactive phase. And this is higher than the baseline, which means it leaves behind some effect. And the effect of all interventions is to try and bring this closer to the baseline. And this is the classical Rundle's curve. The ocular symptoms we are familiar with, involving the orbit, muscles, and the tissues of eyelid, conjunctiva, and cornea. The ocular signs are accordingly proptosis, extraocular muscle restriction, eyelid signs, conjunctival corneal signs, and the major risk of optic neuropathy due to compression. So these all need to be in all cases at all the visits and appropriately staged and classified. We must monitor these patients for visual acuity, visual fields, color vision, optic nerve edema at each stage to look for the earliest signs of compressive dysthyroid optic neuropathy. Glaucoma or raised intraocular pressure may also be a factor. Imaging is important in certain cases. Muscle thickening is very characteristic, and we need to differentiate the muscle predominant and the fat predominant disease. Apical crowding is something to look out for the dysthyroid optic neuropathy. The classification, the classical no-specs classification is no longer preferred, and clinical activity score given by Moritz et al. Is very often followed to look for activity. And the classical 7 signs, 1 point is given for each, and a score of 3 or above is considered as active thyroid disease. So this is what we follow for activity, and for the severity into mild, moderate, and severe, the UGOGO classification is usually followed. The disease, when it becomes sight-threatening, is classified as a separate group. So this adds to what you have with regard to activity in regard to the severity and its potential to affect the sight. The management comprises smoking cessation is one very important aspect. Thyroid status is another one. And we look at some of these other aspects more closely. Some of these conservative measures, including lubricants, elevated head, and prevention of exposure keratopathy, are important. There is enough evidence that smoking cessation is very important to prevent the severe form of disease. Corticosteroids remain the mainstay for us until the newer available drugs become less expensive, and IV therapy has been shown to be more effective than oral therapy. They are more particularly used in compressive optic neuropathy and for moderate to severe disease. And there are various options for intravenous therapy. One of the commonly followed regimens is 0.5 gram per week for 6 consecutive weeks, followed by a less robust dosing schedule with a total not to exceed 8 grams. It was shown that if you approach that 8-gram dose, it is more efficacious than using lower dosages of steroids. Orbital irradiation has its own place, particularly in those with severe thyroid eye disease. And we know that optic neuropathy and soft tissue changes respond better than proptosis and extraocular muscle disease. And a dose of 20 gray is often used. There are other regimes which are less dose intensive. Biologics have again a role which is yet to be established, but they're being increasingly used. Rituximab therapy has been used in several series, but without any conclusive results. Teprotumumab has come as an extremely promising therapy with a multicentric study on intravenous therapy every 3 weeks for 24 weeks, showing a good therapeutic response starting within 6 weeks, and nearly 69% of patients showed a response, with a number of parameters showing regression. Decompression is indicated when there is corneal exposure or sight-threatening optic nerve compression, but increasingly we use it for active orbitopathy, especially with congestive change, cases with congestive changes, even without activity, and for aesthetic indications. It is important to see whether it is a predominantly fat disease or predominantly extraocular muscle disease in deciding your method of decompression. Fat predominant decompression may be adequate in those where fat predominant disease is present. In others, removal of bone may be necessary. Isolated fat decompression works in approximately causing 0.93 regression per milliliter of fat removed, and it has minimal side effects. In muscle predominant disease, you need to combine the bony decompression, but with increased risk of induced diplopia or other problems. The severer degrees of exophthalmos will require a deep lateral wall decompression as well, but with greater risk. And these are the areas in the lateral wall which are particularly targeted. With even severer disease, you may need to combine it with a medial wall and a floor decompression. And you can have a graded response based on amount of the proptosis that is present. Compressive optic neuropathy, you need to be more focused at treating the apical regions, including the posterior part of the ethmoids and the palatine bone. Because unless you target them, you will not get a decompression of the optic nerve well. For aesthetic goals, you need to customize it well, considering patients' old photographs to see which bones need maximum alteration. The current commonly used approaches are the upper lid crease incision, transconjunctival, including the transcaruncular approach. And these are the approaches which are aesthetically good and provide good results. An example of a transconjunctival decompression, pre-op, post-op, side view on the both the sides. When used for congestive orbitopathy, again, the results can be quite dramatic. For cosmetic indications, you may need to combine a decompression with an surgery for eyelid retraction. You need to follow the order of orbital decompression, followed by motility, and followed by eyelid surgery. And this may be required both for upper and lower lid. Various approaches for the lid retraction are present for upper lid and lower lid, and they yield fairly good results with proper selection of cases. But a better understanding of the disease and improvements in medical therapy and improved minimally invasive and customized surgical approaches have led to much more gratifying outcomes in the management of thyroid eye disease. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful talk. We all know Dr. Grover for his great oratory skills and he's an epitome of oculoplasty. He is a recipient of Padam Shri. He was past president of All India Ophthalmological Society and OPI, and also of Asia Pacific Society. So it's always wonderful listening to him. And as usual, this talk also was very lucid. So I think with these words, we shall have our next speaker. In this particular session, all the speakers are so giant, so that it's thought that probably they do not require a formal introduction. That's why I think Dr. Santosh Honawar was also not introduced formally. We all know Dr. Santosh Honawar. He has given first talk. He is currently the Editor General of IJO. He is the first Indian who has received Lifetime Achievement Award from American Academy of Ophthalmology, beside other achievements which he is carrying. So with these words, I'll request Dr. Feroz to call upon our subsequent speaker, Dr. Kasturi, with her brief introduction. Dr. Feroz, please.
He told me not to introduce anyone.
Dr. Usha, do you want to invite Dr. Kasturi? Well, okay. So we have Dr. Kasturi here, who is the director of Sri Shankardeva Nethralaya, Guwahati, a fantastic oculoplastic surgeon. Over to you, ma'am, for the next topic.
Yeah, am I audible, Feroz? Am I
ma'am.
audible?
Yeah.
Okay, at the outset, I thank Feroz and AIOS and OPAI for this wonderful national symposium. So I'll be speaking on technological advances in orbital surgery. So I believe that there are 5 ways how technology can shape the future of the orbital surgery, and it basically includes the navigation guidance, the 3D printing, the sonic aspiration, robotic surgery, and the AR and the VR. So I feel the navigation guided surgery is a cutting edge technology for precision surgery, having a 5 years experience for multiple indications. But today I'll be restricting basically for the orbital and the optic canal fracture. I believe that this is the system which should be used when we go for a very deep surgery, especially in the orbital apex, where you have the optic canal and the superior orbital fissure, and a small trivial injury in the optic canal can lead to traumatic optic neuropathy, which can be due to a shearing force leading to indirect optic neuropathy, or due to a multiple fracture, which is leading to a direct traumatic optic neuropathy. So what is this system? This is basically a GPS in which we set a target and aim to reach the destination with precision and accuracy. We have all the data in the CD, and this CD is placed in the console, and then you can see all the in the CD in all the levels, the sagittal, coronal, and the axial, and then you need to mark the. Can you mute? Someone is talking.
Everyone, please
Can you
keep yourself
start
on the mute.
Electromagnetic field, and you have a stylet. This stylet actually guides us where do we reach, and then accordingly we plan up the surgery. So I have been using it extensively for customized reconstruction, especially for the reconstruction of the fractures, where both the vertical matrices and the horizontal matrices are being involved, and especially for those big fractures where there's so much of impure fracture involving the orbital rim and also involving the walls of the orbit. So I feel this navigation really helps in customized reconstruction of the fracture of the orbital wall. So what is this customized reconstruction? This is basically you mirror the normal orbit over the abnormal orbit, that is the orbit which got expanded with the fracture, with all the orbital contents being in the sinus. Then you measure the difference between the normal orbit to that of the expanded orbit, and you see how much is the difference. And you have an algorithm, like I have set up my algorithm. I feel that for every 3.5 to 4 millimeter difference,
Dr.
you need
Kasturi,
an
just a
implant.
second, ma'am. Ma'am, 1 second. Dr. Banta Anil Kumar, can you please mute yourself, or the technical team?
Can I proceed, Feroz?
There is a lot of disturbance, right?
Yeah, I think I should proceed.
1 second, Dr. Kasturi.
Yeah.
Please,
दालचन जी, आप सुन रहे हो? दालचन जी?
can you mute from the back end?
Yes, I'm just trying to do that. दालचन जी, hello.
সোয়াবিনের চিপস হবে, সোয়াবিন, পাপড়, সোয়াবিনের চিপস, পাপড়।
Yeah. And then, sorry. So this is where you do a mirroring, and once I should start. Can you hear? Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes, we
Yeah.
can.
Then you do the mirroring, and this mirroring where you mirror the normal over the abnormal. And once you start the surgery, you will know how much amount of reconstruction or the volume replacement you need to do. So once you do, you set up the system. Now see, before the surgery, you can see my stylet outer, it has gone down into the maxillary sinus because everything is opened up. Then you go ahead with the surgery, and the surgery requires good amount of volume. So nowadays, I prefer using the MTM or the MTB implants. This really implant gives a very good volume, approximately 3, so I get approximately 6 millimeter volume. And once you're done with this type of surgery, then at the end of the surgery, you put the stylet, you see your reconstruction has been very adequate, and you cannot move the stylet now into the maxillary sinus, and this is within the orbit itself. So these are some of the examples where you can see such a bad fracture, and this is the same thing mirroring, where the most important thing that in bad fractures like this, where you have also the deficiency of the horizontal buttress. So you need to stabilize first the horizontal buttress, and then you keep on manipulating the walls. This is the infraorbital nerve, and once you manipulate the fracture and you put the implant, and then you can see at the end of the surgery, when you place the implant, you will see that it has been mirrored well and you have done a good reconstruction. Another patient where you can see a very good reconstruction that has been seen, and this is a titanium implant that you can see, which has been placed very in the proper place. Even in the delayed fracture, in the very, very complicated fracture like this, where you have the fracture extending or involving the whole of the posterior ledge out here. So these are the situation where there's so much of canthal dystopia, like this are all bad NOE fracture. So these are the fractures also where you need to do a good reconstruction, good mirroring, and you need to measure how much amount of volume you want to give it. And along with the volume reconstruction at the end of the surgery, you also need to reconstruct the medial canthal. And then you can measure at the end of the surgery whether appropriate correction has been done. And this is the result you can see in the very early, that is 1 month post-operative period. So this challenging patient where the impure fracture, where there's involvement of the wall, involvement of the rim, and where you can see where you can mirror in the other way, the whole socket also you can mirror, and you can measure the amount of volume that is being required. And like in this patient, I have realized that it is really, he needs a huge amount of volume. So I have used a double stack the 2 Medpur implant, and I have staggered one over the other. And then once it is being placed, also the MPL has been corrected. And then at the end of the surgery, you can see that it gives a very good correction. And you can see these are the titanium plates that are being placed in the rim. These are the vertical matrices. Then you correct the walls. And once the beautiful thing is that you can see how much of the volume that has been treated. You see so much of volume expansion. And after the surgery, the volume expansion is much less. So I have already mentioned that it is the system when you go for the apical surgery. If you look to this video here, you will understand. See, I am in the orbital apex. I have planned for optic canal decompression. But here, since I have not done a complete de-roofing, I am not being able to enter the optic canal. Every time I'm putting my stylet, the stylet is going into the sinus. So once I complete the de-roofing, I have removed the medial wall and also the superior wall of the optic canal. Now you will see that it really guides you. Now you can see my stylet goes to the whole of the optic canal from the orbital end to the cranial end. This is what you are saying in the coronal section. You can see it is going to the roof of the canal. It shows that, yes, now you have completed the surgery. So it's a very good guidance to do in a complicated situation like this, especially when you do in the optic canal. Like this is a situation where it's a very minimally surgery where you tells you how much to go and where to go. And how do you reach the optic canal? Like you can see, this is the optic canal with the annulus of zinc. So with a very less manipulation, it gives a very precise location. Where is the lesion or where is the target? How do you reach there with a minimal, and how do you go to the distant region that you want to go? Another important use of this is the localization of foreign body, especially if you have a foreign body here in the where there's a fracture of the frontal bone, and we're so scared of touching the frontal bone because we know whenever the frontal bone bleeds, it's very difficult to control. And many times, even if there's a fracture, we never correct this. But when you have a foreign body big palate like this, so you have to do a very minimalistic surgery. And see, I have really fashioned my plane of entry. And how do I go? I have just followed this track. And by following the track, you can see that very nicely I could remove such a big palate with a very, very minimal manipulation. And ultimately, I could salvage the eye of this patient. So this, I feel, is a wonderful tool when you really want to go for a deep surgery, especially in the orbital apex, where this is a case of tumor, where you can see it has involved the superior orbital fissure and entered into midbrain. So especially in situation like this, when you want to do a precise surgery. So the question is that all in the management of the orbital fracture? I think no, this is just a beginning, and there's a lot to come, and there's no limit to which the technology will evolve, or with continuous development, it will keep expanding. And I feel that 3D printing also helps in the management of the orbital fracture, wherein we do a 2D imaging in the DICOM format. Then you convert it into the 3D image, and this 3D image is taken into 360-degree rotation. And once you have the 3D images, next what you do, you go for a 3D modeling, and then they export in the surface tessellation format. And once this has been exported to the surface tessellation format, you have the 3D print. And in a complex fracture like this, you really need a 3D printing, which really helps in a precise, reconstruction of the orbit. And I have been using it for multiple fracture, as you can see. And I feel that this 3D printing, besides helping in the orbital fracture reconstruction, is a very good education device. And also for the anophthalmic socket, there are multiple literatures on it. And especially in an anophthalmic socket like this, where you see there's on the whole absence of the inferior orbital wall. So when you have a situation like this, you really need to do a 3D printing, and you really need to find out how much amount of contracture. And this is a patient who has a total shallow. So you need to plan it how much anterior rotation or anterior shifting of the anterior orbital, inferior orbital wall you need to do in order to make the socket deep. So this is really because of these challenges I could take up with this system. I have realized that I could also innovate my own surgical technique, wherein in a situation like this, what I do, once you measure how much amount of shallowness is there, you can rotate the inferior orbital wall, that is the maxilla. You can cut through the maxilla and you go by anterior rotation. And then already you have measured the volume by the mirroring in the navigation system. And here you cannot give a graph. The dermis sweat will not give. You need to give a flap. So you manage how much amount of volume you need to do, and the best way of volume giving is by especially in situation like this, with the temporalis muscle transfer. So you can really.
Very sorry to interrupt, ma'am. If you can quickly.
I'll just finish it within 1 minute. Is it okay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So other advances are basically the Sonopet, which is much awaited now, and you know that this is something like a phaco system. And the AI and the AR and the AV is something which we really want, like the robotic surgery which has come, and this is really good in hard to reach area. And there are multiple reports being used for the orbital surgery, the robotic surgery. But and this is my last slide, what I want to insist is that actually it is an augmented reality, which is the future of the orbital surgery. It gives really amazing earth-shattering viewing technology, because the surgeon gets immersed in the real-time scenario, not the animated scenario, which is both head mounted and also microscopic mounted. So advantage is that when you do the surgery, you have the picture, whether it's a fluorescent angiography or the CT, MR, actually on the patient's field. So with this, I conclude. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Kasturi, for covering this topic exhaustively. Our next speaker is Dr. Milind Naik, and he's a consultant at LV Prasad Eye Institute, and he's a very well-known and sought-after aesthetic surgeon. Dr. Milind Naik, please.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be amongst friends and teachers here. I just upload my presentation. Oops. Are you able to see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So after the wonderful talks and the recent advances, I'm going to really shift to the basics, and we'll talk primarily about periocular rejuvenation. And I'm basically going to focus on two small areas in the interest of time. One is Botox, that too contouring rather than just treating the wrinkles, and the second is with fillers. So we all know that botulinum toxin is a very popular treatment for wrinkles. And these are pretty straightforward. I'm sure everyone who is on the panel and the attendees here would have practiced one or multiple indications. And this is a pretty straightforward option where you relax the muscle and the wrinkle reduces. But there's something more interesting to this, which is called as facial contouring, where you actually change the anatomy by distributing the forces or redistributing the forces between two opposing muscles. And one example here is the shape of the brow, as you can see when there is an attempted elevation. So if you want to change the shape of the brow with the tail end slightly higher than the head, then what you basically need to do is to relax the frontalis muscle in the center. This is your eyebrow. And if you inject in the frontalis area and the procerus, then the head of the brow is going to come down. And if you block the orbicularis on the outer aspect of the orbital rim, then the tail is going to go up. So you redistribute the balance between frontalis muscle and the orbicularis. So that's where you would block the orbicularis, and in the central area you block the frontalis. Obviously, these changes are more evident in a female brow, and the results can be very subtle, as you can see in this particular patient. For anything drastic that one would want, a surgical option is required. But this is a good option to keep in mind, especially when you have very little hooding of the upper eyelid. Patient is not really keen about a bleph, and you can really take that skin fold up by just elevating the brow in this manner. Talking about fillers, we had a session 2 days ago, but I'll repeat this because it's very important. Both these patients tend to have a fold in the upper eyelid skin, and at the first reflex, one would think of a blepharoplasty. But this skin fold is appearing only because there is a collapse of the outward contour of the brow, and that is because of volume loss. So all you need to do here is to fill the brow with either filler or fat. That depends on what is the parallel procedure that's planned for the patient. And once you do that, not only will that fold disappear, but you will also get a convex contour to the brow, and that is what most patients desire. And this can be achieved with a filler injection into the brow area. Now, this is a video which just shows brow injection. So here we are injecting beyond the orbital rim. So this is not really going into the orbit, not transseptal, but into the retroorbicularis oculi fat, just above the periosteum of the superolateral orbital rim. So here is a change after the filler injection into the brow. Here is another patient. You can see this fold disappearing after brow filling. Side view of the same patient. And about tear trough, I'm just going to block this voice here. Oops, sorry. Okay. So here what we are trying to do is to fill within the tear trough, but not exactly into the depth. What I tend to inject nowadays is along the cheek slope of the tear trough and not really into the depth of the valley. And filling into the cheek slope not only gives me a thick skin beyond which the filler can hide, but it also gives me a better contour in these patients. Okay. Just going to move to the next slide showing some of the results. Here is a young patient. These two are young patients who have a tear trough, one more gross than the other, but both were managed just with a filler. Here you can see a little bit of tendril effect. Another patient where filling into the cheek anatomy. It's a relatively young patient, but with a deep sulcus. Filling into the cheek anatomy actually reduces the tear trough. You can see that there is a bulk appearing here. Although this, if you look in isolation, it will look like an overcorrection. But if you compare it to the pre-anatomy, the pre-injection anatomy, this patient looks much less tired in the post photograph. Another example of filling into the cheek area, into the tear trough area, sorry. And here is another deep tear trough in a young person filled with a deep supraperiosteal filler. Another example, tear trough, which is extending all the way along the lateral orbital rim. The entire area was filled. This particular pigment patch was also treated by the dermatologist with a chemical peel. Side view of the same patient. As you have age going beyond 45, it gets a little tricky because the skin elasticity is low, but there are still some patients on the fence where you can get a good result and get away with a filler rather than doing a surgical correction. And in patients with slight amount of fat prolapse, you don't really have to jump into a surgery, but you can just fill the gutter underneath it and the contours change and they look more youthful. So just to summarize here, we talked more about contouring with Botox rather than wrinkle treatment. And for the fillers, we focused in the interest of time on just the brow and the tear trough. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milind, for being very brief and relevant. And we will move on to the next talk, and which is by Dr. Mohammad Javed Ali. Dr. Javed Ali is an internationally recognized oculoplastic surgeon specializing in lacrimal surgeries and is a leader in advances of lacrimal drainage sciences. And he has more than 473 publications. He's also a recipient of the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize by the Government of India. And he has many more prizes and titles to his, which this time will not permit. And one of his big contribution is this book on principles and practice of lacrimal surgery. And this is the most comprehensive treatise on the subject. Dr. Javed, please.
Thank you, Dr. Usha, for the kind introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes, Dr. Javed.
Yeah. Okay, so I would like to thank AIOS and Fairuz for giving me this opportunity to talk on a subject which is a little less discussed, canalicular obstructions. Let's get straight. These are my financial disclosures. I would recommend this particular major review in current eye research where we actually described and discussed various modalities of canalicular reconstructions and recanalization. So for canalicular obstruction, we need to just answer 5 questions and we'll answer them one after another. 5 important questions, right? The first question, how common are they? So if you look at this major epidemiological review that we published, which has more than 20,000 cases of lacrimal drainage disorders, you see that the bicanalicular obstructions were the commonest among, I'm just restricting myself only to canalicular obstructions. The bicanalicular were common, followed by isolated lower canalicular, then common canalicular, then canalicular stenosis, followed by isolated upper canalicular obstructions. And you see it ranges, all of them range somewhere less than 1% overall. So they're not so very common also. The second question to answer is what are the causes of them? There you see it's all listed causes of canalicular obstructions. But what I have not mentioned here is a bulk of them which fall under the idiopathic category, where it's not that there's no reason, it's just that we are still unaware of those reasons for canalicular obstructions. The third question, and I think it's a very important question, is how would you diagnose it and how would you differentiate a canalicular stenosis from a canalicular obstructions? There are a host in a lot of ways in which you can do, and I think the simplest one is a good clinical examination with specific probes. You can use Clark 30 probes or Bowman 40 probes, or even better if you can have it, it's not expensive, but if you can have it, the Miyake probes, which are specifically designed to differentiate between a canalicular stenosis and an obstruction. And then obviously there are dacryoendoscopies and imaging modalities. These are specifically useful, more so the imaging modalities, if you are planning to intervene using, say, angioplastic catheters, if you want to treat the canalicular stenosis or obstructions, then those becomes more pertinent. These are examples of canalicular stenosis. If you see the picture on the right, I'm just showing a sequence of those images where how it gets narrowed down as we progress. You see from the first to the third picture, you see how it's getting narrower and narrower, and it's almost occluded in the third picture. But these are all still stenosis. As compared to look at the obstructions, right? Obstructions don't narrow down that way. So you still have the rim within the canalicular lumen that you see. You can see a rim of nice circumferential constriction. And then as you go near, you can see that how completely it is actually blocked. And that's a dead end. So if I take you back again, look at this. It's very easy to differentiate canalicular stenosis and look at this, obstructions. Now there are other modalities with which you can use it, and these are being increasingly used specifically because these are all like doing an angioplasty. So whenever you are using those kind of modalities, these are very useful intraoperatively and immediately post-op also. So this is an example that you see of the left side where you see an isolated lower canalicular obstruction, and there you can see a lot of dye spilling in the left side. As compared to the right side, you can see right till the nasolacrimal duct, it's quite healthy. Then dacroscintigraphy. I won't go into those details of all the characteristics for the want of time. I just want to give you an overview of the canalicular obstructions. There you see dacroscintigraphies. This is an example. If you look on the picture on the right, there you see the left side common canalicular obstruction is very evident. CT DCGs or MR DCGs can be utilized to identify the exact location of that one. The picture on the left shows a common canalicular obstruction, and on the right also shows common canalicular obstruction with a lot of spillage of dye into the conjunctival fornix. Now, the fourth question to answer, and which is important because there is a lot of confusion about what is proximal, what is mid, and what is distal. And if you look at the literature, there was a lot of confusion. So what we decided was to simplify this one based on two parameters. One on the newer anatomy of the canaliculus that we have published, and second based on the outcomes of it. And the third reason, if you look at from the management aspect, is how commonly is a location at a given point has other associated obstructions or stenosis, like at what point in the canaliculi, if I find a stenosis or an obstruction, will I likely find a similar one in other parts of the lacrimal drainage? So based on these three parameters, we have simply divided it as proximal up to 3 to 6 is distal, and anything beyond 6 is distal, because unlike the previous classifications which talk about beyond 8, that's not true based on the newer anatomy that we know. So anything beyond 6 should be considered as distal. Now, the fifth question to answer is, how do we manage? I won't go into, again, the details of the surgical techniques and the complications and how do you manage each one of them. But just to give you an overview, canalicular trephination, both bacterioendoscopy guided or not guided, is one of the commonest modalities of management. And the Sisler's trephine that you see is quite commonly used. And it is very specifically designed for the canaliculi. And if you look at how you assess the canalicular obstructions, how you prime the trephine, and how you go about it, and how you maintain the course. So the anatomical course is something which is very important in trephination, and that needs a good amount of training. I would put the training for canalicular trephination, the learning curve is much steeper than what one would expect from an endoscopic DCR also. So because of the complications and possibility of very easy false passage without the surgeon realizing it. So I won't go into those details. Those are all published, and all these images that you see are from the atlas. So you can go back and read those details of it. And this is just to give you an example of the scar cylinder and how you can actually sculpt the canalicular obstructions from within the lumen, and you can have very decent kind of results. These are examples of the scar cylinders within the lumen of the trephines. Well, for a good chunk of cases, I also believe in doing an endoscopic guided trephination, where here I've opened up the lacrimal sac and under guidance, I'm getting the trephine here. And this is also something which we have published, and you can read the details of the indications and when we do those kind of things. Obviously, there are a lot of advantages, and one of those examples, the photograph that you see, how beautifully that canalicular scar is sculpted, if you can see that image of it. So there are a lot of advantages of doing this, and I won't go into these complications for the sake of time. The upcoming modality is balloon canaliculoplasty, more so for canalicular stenosis. And I'm finding increasingly with the use of angioplastic catheters now, the results are appearing better. What previously we used to do was to use the regular 2 millimeter and 3 millimeters, and 2 and 3 millimeters were designed way back in a decade ago, and it is not sacrosanct that why should we use 2 millimeter. There's no justification why somebody uses 2 millimeter or 3 millimeter. So the coronary balloons give a wide range from 0.5 to almost like 10 millimeter in diameter. So there's a lot of room for maneuvering. So this is just an example of how we can do a balloon canaliculoplasty. This is using a 1 millimeter coronary angioplasty catheter. I won't go into the details. It's all published. You can read that. I have found that this modality is really helpful in those chemotherapy-induced canalicular stenosis. This is an example of Pemetrexed. Just look at the picture A and A and D. Look at the difference in the punctum and canaliculus that we have made. If you look at picture B and E, look at the canalicular stenosis by Decker endoscopy and look at the difference of following balloon dilatation. So it's quite dramatic. The last modality of management is CDCR. I won't go into those details. It's quite well-established modality, and we have a host of papers on that. You can read the indications and how to manage that, and including the quality of life. So in conclusion, I would say that for lacrimal surgeons, the most important challenge is to differentiate accurately between a stenosis versus an obstruction. And balloon canaliculoplasty is coming up as a very nice modality to manage it in a little less invasive way. And today we have workable solutions for canalicular obstructions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Javed. Our next speaker is Dr. Usha Kim, and she'll be talking on pediatric eyelid anomalies. We all know that Dr. Usha Kim is our current president of Oculoplastic Association of India. She is the chief of Orbit Oculoplastic Ocular Oncology Services at the Aravind Eye Hospital, Madurai. She has more than 70 ophthalmologists have undergone long-term fellowship training under her. In addition, she is also involved in the key leadership position in Aravind Eye Care System, and she's also the director of Allied Ophthalmic Personal Training. Dr. Usha, please.
Thanks, Dr. Usha. Usha to Usha, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'll go straight to the topic. After all those elegant talks, I think mine is the simplest one to address. So let me go through it very quickly. But these are very important areas, and I think most of us will come across these conditions quite often. Pediatric eyelid anomalies are most challenging. It may be present at birth as a result of the abnormal embryogenesis, or it may occur at later stages as the child matures. So it could fall under the entity of developmental. So what are the anomalies that we commonly come across? Entropion, ectropion ptosis, lid retraction, epicanthal folds, blepharophimosis, colobomas, cryptophthalmus, and canthal dystopias. I have not included some of the lash anomalies, specifically because of the lack of pine. Now, if you look at the ptosis, you will have simple, complicated blepharophimosis, synkinetic ptosis in the form of Marcus-Gunn syndrome and misdirected third nerve. The features being specifically absent or poorly developed eyelid crease, decreased levator function, or sometimes absent levator function, eyelid lag on down gaze. This is very typical of the congenital ptosis entities. So here you see a simple ptosis wherein it's unilateral and corrected by a simple procedure, frontalis sling, because of the poor levator action. You have a similar scenario, but it's a bilateral entity again corrected by a simple procedure, frontalis sling, because of the poor levator action. A word of caution here, you will have to elicit whether there is any evidence of visual impact or resulting in amblyopia before you correct these patients. Blepharophimosis involves ptosis, epicanthus inversus, and telecanthus. The ptosis, you will have a horizontal and vertical shortening of the lid. So you will have to correct the vertical shortening by doing a ptosis correction, which is usually frontalis sling procedure. The horizontal shortening, you need to do a lateral canthoplasty, and the epicanthus inversus is often corrected using the viviplasty. And the telecanthus is corrected by doing a transnasal wiring. Marcus gun jaw winking phenomenon is usually unilateral, can also present bilaterally. And the management is generally based on the amount of ptosis, which is usually mild to moderate, and also the amount of lid excursions on opening the jaw or the sideways movement of the jaw. So you would end up doing a disinsertion of the levator palpebrae superioris or aponeurosis, resection, and then additionally you augment it with the frontalis sling in order to correct the ptosis. Now coming to the third nerve palsy, which we occasionally see in this patient, you have a squint as well as a ptosis. So you initially correct the horizontal squint and then do either a levator correction, or you can resection, or you can end up doing a frontalis sling. But you should first correct the squint before you go in for a ptosis correction. The horizontal squint can be corrected alongside, vertical squint can precede the ptosis correction. Now, congenital ectropion often is because of the vertical insufficiency of the anterior lamellae, and in mild cases you can resort to patching or a temporary tarsography. In this case, actually, I have tried and just done a tarsography, and eventually it resolves. Sometimes you may have to resect an excess too, and in severe cases you may have to resort to skin grafts. Like in this particular scenario, you have to resort to doing a skin graft. Entropions, very rare, but we do see occasionally, and that this can be corrected by a Weiss procedure. In this particular scenario, I have corrected with a Weiss procedure. Uriblephron is a horizontal widening, excuse me, widening of the palpebral fissure. There is inferior displacement of the lateral canthal tendon, and there is often an anti-mongoloid slant. It is usually managed by doing a lateral canthal repositioning or a lateral tarsal strip, depending upon the amount of the slippage of the lateral canthal area. The epicanthus is often because of the medial canthal fold, because of the immature midfacial bones. There is often a pseudo-esotropia. If it is a tarsalis, it's usually the upper lid which is involved. Inversus involves the lower lid, and palpebralis involves both upper and lower lid. Management could just be an observation. Sometimes it resolves with facial maturity, or you can do a Z-plasty or a viviplasty. Epiblephron is usually medial. There is a fold of skin accentuated on down gaze, and it's often treated by doing a simple Hodge procedure where you do a skin muscle, orbicularis muscle excision. Here you see a writer has a medial facial cleft and lefter has an epiblephron which is being corrected. Colobomas are usually isolated. It could be unilateral. Usually we see it in the upper lid. We can also see it in the lower lid. And the management is often earlier on, you start with lubrication, especially when it's in the upper lid, because you need to avoid the corneal exposure. You can either do a direct repair or you can do a lid sharing procedure. The associated syndromes are often Fraser's syndrome. It's very, very rare, but we do see occasionally Goldenhar syndrome, which is very common, Tricher-Colin syndrome. And Goldenhar's is often associated with a limbal dermoid, preauricular skin tags, as in this particular case, ptosis, nasolacrimal duct obstruction, coloboma of the middle third of the upper lid, usually. The systemic findings are vertebral anomalies, cardiac and pulmonary anomalies. Fraser syndrome, rare, but we do see it is an autosomal recessive condition associated with cryptophthalmos. We have seen bilateral cases as well. Is often associated with mental retardation. There is a defect of the auricle. There is a genital anomaly. Cleft lip or palate is associated. There is laryngeal stenosis or atresia and cardiac defects. these patients do not survive very long. Microphthalmos is, you see in this particular case, it seems like a complete ptosis, but after the prosthesis, this is how the child looks. So to conclude, it's a very challenging scenario. It's often vision threatening, especially when conditions like ptosis, it can lead on to amblyopia or astigmatism resulting in amblyopia. It is associated with multiple anomalies requiring multiple surgeries or multiple stages of surgeries. And amblyopia is a condition which we ought to keep in mind. It could result as a result of the condition or as a result of the treatment. And this should be taken care of as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, ma'am. You have covered such a vast topic so lucidly, well within the time. So that speaks volume about your oratory skills. Our next speaker is Dr. Vikas Menon. Dr. Vikas Menon is a very humble oculoplastic surgeon. He is very competent. Right now, he is at Arvind Hospital, Chennai. He has got good experience of working in Northern India as well as in Southern India. So we all look forward to hear Dr. Vikas Menon on a very important topic of ocular adnexal malignancies. Dr. Vikas, please.
Good evening, everybody. Are the slides visible and am I audible?
Absolutely, Dr. Vikas.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fairuz, for having me here, and Dr. Mukesh, thank you so much for the kind introduction. So in these next 10 minutes, I am just going to take you quickly through a very vast topic, which actually has plethora of books written on it. So I'll just try to highlight some of the common features by which actually how we can identify these tumors, how we can identify these malignancies when they come in the OPD, and tell you about some of the salient features which one should not miss when these patients are there. Now, when we talk about ocular adnexa and the malignancies, what we are actually talking about is tumors and malignancies which are arising from the ocular surface, tumors which are arising from the eyelids, and tumors which arise from the orbits or invade the orbit secondarily. Ocular surface tumors, we know the conjunctiva is the site of some of the common pigmented or non-pigmented conjunctival malignancies. And ocular surface squamous neoplasia is the most common malignancy of ocular surface. It's a term which encompasses dysplasia, carcinoma in situ, and squamous cell carcinoma, depending upon the depth of the anaplastic cells invasion into the conjunctival layers. So some of the presentations, it's a condition which can masquerade itself in a number of as a number of different types of presentations, and sometimes mimic some benign conditions as well, like pterygium or pingicula, or sometimes limbal hypertrophy. All these conditions it can just mimic. So I'm going to run you through some of the common types of presentations which we see. Now, if you see a mass like this, which is gelatinous in nature, whitish in color, hanging onto the limbus, stuck on the limbus, having some feeder vessels going into it, suspect OSSN. Another common variant is the papilliform variant, wherein you see a frond-like tissue which is stuck on the epibulbar surface. If you have a papilliform kind of a mass on the epibulbar surface, particularly near the limbus, suspect that it could be a malignancy. If you have a papilliform kind of a lesion, a frond kind of a mass stuck on the epibulbar surface, and you see these tiny intralesional blood vessels which are arising from the mass and then dipping into the mass, suspect that you could be possibly dealing with a malignancy. If you see a leash of feeder vessels coming from the fornices and touching the mass, reaching up to the limbus, and there is this papilliform or sometimes even a nodular mass which has got these other features like intrinsic vasculature or a papilliform pattern, suspect that you could be dealing with a malignancy, ocular surface squamous cell carcinoma in this situation. One of the most specific highlights of these tumors, if you see in your case deposition of whitish keratin onto the surface of the tumor, then this gives you a strong indication that what you are seeing in front of you in the OPD is not just a benign thing, but it is something which could possibly be malignant, and you need to take appropriate action for this patient. Now, a patient which shows you all the features that I have just described, there's a lot of keratin on the surface, you've got lots of intrinsic vasculature, prominent vessels on this mass. It's a epibulbar mass which is frond-like, and then it has got some gelatinous component as well, and lots of dilated feeder vessels which are arising from the fornices and reaching up onto the limbus. So whenever you see a combination of either all of these signs, or you see maybe, let's say, 2 or 3 signs which are which I just enumerated, your suspicion for a malignancy should be raised, and your management plan should be tailored accordingly. Sometimes you don't see these classical signs, and you see that it's a kind of a chronic blepharoconjunctivitis which is not responding to your medications. Now beware, if it is particularly a unilateral condition in an elderly person, look carefully. Sometimes you will see these tiny vessels into the and a flattish kind of a mass growing over the ocular surface. This can be a diffuse type of OSSN, which has to be differentiated from a pagetoid variant of sebaceous gland carcinoma, which we will see subsequently, wherein the lid margin is also affected. If you evert these eyelids, many a times you will find extension of the tumor onto the palpebral conjunctiva as well. So you need to be careful in all such situations, particularly if it's an elderly patient coming with a unilateral chronic blepharoconjunctivitis not responding to your routine treatment. Rose Bengal stain is a simple test which you can do in your OPD, and OSSNs typically take up this Rose Bengal stain very well, and it also helps you to identify the subclinical area. Sometimes the mass may not be obvious into the entire in its entire extent, and you may need to pick up some. You may have some subclinical involvement of the conjunctiva as well, which will be picked up by Rose Bengal stain. Standard of care remains surgery for most of the invasive tumors, and nowadays there is a lot of talk happening on topical chemotherapy. Everyone wants to give chemotherapy for all their OSSN patients, which is not the correct approach. There are very specific indications for topical chemotherapy, and here I list these as some of the important indications which one should remember, and not subject just every patient to topical chemotherapy. It is indicated to excision for chemo reduction in diffuse lesions. It is indicated if there is a positive excision edge which you found on your histopathology after excision, if there are multiple recurrences with treatment failures in pure corneal OSSNs, or in elderly or debilitated patients who are not fit for surgery. In other cases where you have an invasive carcinoma, topical therapy is not indicated. It's mainly indicated only for superficial tumors which have been confined to the layers above the basement membranes. Now moving on to pigmented conjunctival tumors malignancy, which is the conjunctival melanoma. You see if you see a deeply pigmented lesion onto the surface of the conjunctiva with thick nodular components, suspect that it's a melanoma. You take a biopsy, and that might confirm your doubt. Another similar patient with diffuse deep pigmentation of the fornices spilling over to the lid margin and the caruncle with some nodularity at places. Again, this is a conjunctival melanoma. But what is important is to identify the pre-malignant condition, which is the PAM. PAM is primary acquired melanosis, which is like a diffuse, ill-defined pigmentation of the conjunctiva, which sometimes waxes in veins. It occurs in middle-aged adults and may be multifocal as well. So if you identify these cases at this stage, there are specific guidelines when to biopsy and when to treat these lesions. There's not enough time to go into all those details, but the idea is that you should identify these lesions, and if you see the primary acquired melanosis, try to act at this stage so as to prevent the late stage of melanoma, because these cases may have 46% chances of conversion to melanoma. Another, just to complete the scenario, this is lymphoma, where you have a typical salmon colored mass over the ocular surface. Moving on to the eyelids, the most common malignancy in eyelids in our country is sebaceous gland carcinoma. There are some typical features which can help to identify these malignancies. You look at the lid margin, there will be sparsity of eyelashes. You look at the margin, there will be destruction of the eyelid margin architecture. There will be destruction of the meibomian gland orifices, and you will have some yellowish colored nodules along with prominent vessels within the lesion and reaching up to the lesion from periphery. So these are some of the signs which will help you differentiate sebaceous gland carcinoma from other benign lesions of the eyelid. This is an example of the pagetoid variant, where you see there is diffuse thickening of the eyelid margin with all the destruction of the lid margin architecture and sparsity of eyelashes. Particularly if you see this in an eyelid in an elderly patient with unilateral disease, suspect, take a biopsy, do not delay that. This could very well be a pagetoid variant of sebaceous gland carcinoma. Second most common is the basal cell carcinoma, where you see a centrally depressed area along with typical rolled edges on the margins. And you see biopsy these cases and they may turn out to be basal cell carcinoma. And sometimes they get delayed, the diagnosis is delayed, and you may have situations like these which are unpleasant. Or sometimes you have a morpheoform variant where you see inflammation kind of a picture. There is redness diffuse around the lesion, but this is not inflammation. This is another variant of basal cell carcinoma. The standard treatment in all eyelid malignancies is complete excision with clear margins, ideally under frozen section margin control, and conjunctival map biopsy in suspected cases of sebaceous gland carcinoma, and an appropriate technique of reconstruction. Moving on to some signs of orbital malignancies. So orbital tumors are also not so uncommon, and once you start looking at them, so what you should look for in an orbital tumor to rule out the possibility of a malignancy, first of all, is you should do a proper assessment of ptosis, which direction it is coming, abaxial, axial, all those basics. Then size and shape of the tumor. You have to make these diagnoses based on your clinical as well as radiological judgment in cases of orbital tumors. You have to look for margin of the tumor, whether it's well defined or ill defined, and effect on surrounding structures. How is the surrounding bone, and how is the contrast enhancement of the lesion? You must be able to differentiate between a molding of the bone, which can be caused by benign long-standing problems, or you have to differentiate it from the bony dysplasias, which also may occur with benign conditions like neurofibromas. And you should be able to differentiate these bony changes from the bony erosions, which usually arise and highlight that this is a malignancy that you are dealing with, like in case of an adenoid cystic carcinoma like this. Another example where there are a lot of bony changes, this child presented with a mass and in the inferior orbit as well as anterior wall of maxilla, which shows a lot of bony changes. On biopsy, it turned out to be an Ewing sarcoma. Sometimes there can be tumor from the inside of the eye, which can spill over into the orbit. Now, this is a classical example of a retinoblastoma, which has gone orbital. Now, in such cases, always do a B scan. Sometimes just that B scan showing you calcification may give you a clue that what you are dealing with is retinoblastoma, and the proptosis and everything else is secondary to the intraocular tumor.
Dr. Vikas?
Yeah, just last slide. So, and another typical pattern for a tumor on imaging that you can see is the typical molding around the globe. We call this molding, where the tumor is not distorting the globe, but it's actually shaping itself around the globe. This pattern is typically seen in lymphomas. And subsequently, orbital metastasis can also affect the orbit. So there are a wide variety of conditions, and you should keep a low threshold of biopsy in orbital lesions. And most of the times you require a biopsy to confirm whether what you're dealing with is a benign or malignant, apart from the clinical signs, which may give you a certain clue. So to add that, malignancies of ocular head nexa are far more common than we think. It's just about opening our mind and our eyes to it, to the possibility of these malignancies. And once we start seeing, we will start seeing definitely much more than what we, without this background, which we see. Thank you very much.
Very much, Dr. Vikas. So now we have exactly 7 minutes to go for discussion and interaction. Dr. Ravindra Mohan, could you just lead the discussion part of this symposium? We'll keep it.
I think we'll go first speaker onwards. Is Dr. Santosh there?
He is not there, but I think you can, anyone can take a question on Mucor because everyone has been seeing it.
Sure, everybody. Yeah, I have a question. I mean, this is a question to learn. Okay. So with such a great panel, the questions being asked are basically to learn from the speakers and not to something else. So has any of you done bilateral accentration for any patient?
No.
Bilateral accentration.
That's no from me.
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I have a patient who had the intracranial abscess drained and had a very stormy course, but fortunately went home and all her cranial nerves came back, and she's alert mentally, but has got draining wounds in the orbit. Basically, the eyes have become shrunken. She had bilateral ophthalmic artery blocks, and obviously an ischemic orbit with chronic drainage of what looks like necrosed fat. And both eyes are atrophic. But when she's blind, the family seems to be willing to go through an exenteration, but I have this worry about healing. We shouldn't leave her worse than we found her. So between draining pus versus a non-healing socket, I would never think of a bilateral exenteration in any other setup, but this seems to be, so I thought I'll.
It's a very difficult situation. I think I know this patient, Doctor.
You know this patient, Usha, yes.
Yes. Yeah, so I think I think we are justified in this case because it is draining, and I really understand this. It is very difficult for us to take a call at this point. But I think in order to, since she's recovered from the cerebral abscess and she's doing well,
Yes.
and this has been non-healing and discharging, I think we may
Yes.
have to resort to something very destructive, like what you have decided.
But she's now already moving around the house, doing her own work and stuff like that. So phenomenal recovery. And so this is, okay. Thank you for your inputs. And
We'll have the next
any
question.
other-
Yeah, any other questions?
Yeah.
Kesh, Dr. Karan.
Javed there? No one else has questions. I'll ask one to Javed.
So can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Has anybody come across local necrosis after giving tram? So I had this young boy who was young person, about 35 years old. He did well for the first 2 trams. And after the third one, he started developing something which looked like an abscess in the lower orbit. So the tissue over there necrosed and he started draining pus. So I kept in mind that there is enough literature on the local toxicity of amphotericin. So I just debrided that area and sent it for KOH wet mount and fungal culture both. So there was no fungus that was seen in that area, and the culture too turned negative. So the only way that I could explain it was that, like some patients have a reaction to systemic amphotericin, maybe this was a local reaction to amphotericin. Has anybody come across something like this? As of now, in my institution, we have seen some 273 Mucor cases, unilateral and bilateral. So most of them have done well. There has been an arrest of local disease with retrobulbar amphotericin, but this was one patient that set me thinking.
Again, I don't think it's but could I ask you a question, Abhijit? Could it be any other bacterial superadded infection?
Usha, the bacterial cultures were negative.
Okay, fine. Okay, then I think it's a rare.
And there was no sign. Yeah, there was no sign of local inflammation. The eye and the local conjunctiva was absolutely normal. I can share those photographs on our WhatsApp group.
Dr. Abhijit, one question. Was it a retrobulbar or was it in the medial orbit or inferior orbit?
Deep retrobulbar.
Deep retrobulbar. So, I mean, it's most of the drug must be staying there rather than.
I don't know why. But that is why I thought that it is probably a necrotic reaction which has spread in that area like a tissue lysis. That is how I could explain it. I had no other explanation for that.
The other thing is ischemic. Ischemic as well.
Wouldn't that cause a little inflammatory reaction if it was necrotic and lysing and all that happening there?
Actually, there was no pain. He did complain of pain. That was the only symptom. So probably that pain was because of the mass effect of that necrotic tissue which then bulged out. I don't know actually, because the fungal cultures came negative. So that is what actually set me thinking that was this a sterile necrosis in that area, drug induced?
Or maybe mucor induced ischemic necrosis of the tissue, ma'am. Very difficult to say.
I've not seen it any other patient. See, with such a wide, like we have done almost TRAMP for more than almost 136 patients in my college. So this was the only patient who came back had this presentation.
Abhijit, usually amphotericin B causes renal vasoconstriction. They say it causes constriction. Tubular necrosis is also being reported.
Yeah.
About the skin necrosis, maybe some vasoconstrictory effect or something, because it causes gross vasoconstriction.
Maybe, I don't know whether it's vasoconstriction or it's a chemo sort of a chemical reaction there because of the amphotericin. This patient actually did puzzle me a lot because I didn't have an answer. And there was no way for me to prove whether it was vasoconstriction. How can I prove vasoconstriction in a tissue which is so necrotic and fluid?
All right. Yeah. Dr. Ravindra Mohan, you had a question for Javed.
Yes. Dr. Javed?
Yes, sir.
But after you diagnose a canalicular block of any kind, do you routinely subject all these patients to canalicular endoscopy, or what is the role of endoscopy in A, diagnosis, and B, management or post-management follow-up?
Canalicular endoscopy makes the diagnosis. I usually don't use it for every single case. Like if you're using, say, for example, a Miyake 0.45 probe, if you use and you find an obstruction, you know that's an obstruction. It can't be a stenosis, for example. But if there is a doubt about between stenosis and obstruction, that's where dacryl endoscopy comes as a diagnostic help. Based on the cost and other things, I don't think it's quite feasible and based on the time to do it for every case. I still feel that clinical judgment supersedes everything. So if you can do it with a clinical judgment, that's there. But in cases of difficult cases or those cases where I'm thinking of using balloon canaliculoplasty as a modality to manage, that's the cases where I would like to see it dacryl endoscopically.
Maybe one more last question. Or anyone, if you have some, yeah.
Thank you, Fairuz. I think it was excellent. Too many topics, too vast a subject, but all covered. I think it was very well conducted. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah.
Ma'am, may I request you to give a closing remark here?
I think I've made it all very clear. It was a fantastic session. I thought it would, I was just wondering how we would be able to cover it, but all of the speakers have done justice to the topics and given some tips to all of us to learn from. Thank you so much, Fairuz, and the organizing committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, on behalf of the scientific committee, humble gratitude and extremely thankful for all your presence here, although it's 8:30 now almost, and it has been an excellent overview of selected topics over here. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fairuz. Thank you so much, everyone. And with this, the session for this hall ends for the day. Thank you so much. See you all tomorrow at Hall Barakat.